minutes ahead of the rest of us. He took no more than a 15-minute lunch, if he didn't work right through it. And when the rest of us left at 4:30, we waved to him on our way out, knowing that it would probably be another half hour before he followed us. He was dedicated, and he was talented enough that his dedication counted. I assumed he had his sights set on early and rapid promotion, which, with those twins at home, I could appreciate. All of this is to say that when Dan wasn't there and no one knew why, we were inclined to feel a bit more uneasy than we would have otherwise. As we found out the following day, we'd had every right and reason for our concern. Some read it on the front page of the Poughkeepsie Journal with their morning coffee. Others heard it on the radio as they drove to work. Still others had it from Frank Block, who was a volunteer fireman and whose absence the previous day also had been noted, but not connected by anyone to Dan's. There had been an accident. Dan was an early riser, you see, as were the twins. Sometimes his wife Sophie took the opportunity to sleep in a little, but yesterday, for whatever reason, she had risen with the rest of them. It was early enough, just a little past 6, that when Dan suggested the 4 of them nip into town for a quick bite of breakfast before he left for work, the idea seemed reasonable. So they bundled the babies into their car seats and set off. Dan drove, and he failed to fasten his seatbelt, which Sophie noticed. Dan shrugged. It was no big deal. They were only going a short way. "It's your ticket," Sophie said. The Dreschers lived off South Morris Road, which intersects Route 299, the main road into Huguenot, about 3 miles east of town. 299's a fast road, has been for as long as I've lived on this side of the Hudson. There should have been a traffic light where Morris crossed it, instead of a pair of stop signs. Maybe the light wouldn't have made any difference. Maybe the fellow steering the big white 18-wheeler would have had it up around 70 anyway. Dan said he saw the truck approaching from his right as he turned left onto 299, but it didn't look to be moving as fast as it was. He pulled out, and that great white beast slammed into his Subaru like a thunderbolt. Dan was thrown through the windshield, too, as it turned out. Safety. Crushed together, car and truck skidded along the road, jagged bits of metal showering sparks as they went. Before they stopped moving, the car erupted in a fireball that was answered a second later by an explosion from the truck. By the time the first police car raced to the scene, it was too late. It had been too late, I suppose, from the moment Dan's foot pressed on the accelerator. The car swept out onto the road. Could be it had been too late the moment the idiot driving that rig had glanced at his wristwatch, realized that, if his morning delivery was to arrive on schedule, he was going to have to make up some time, and stepped on the gas, shifting up as he did. The fire took his life, which I wish I could say I felt worse about, and it consumed Sophie and the twins. 2 days later, the coroner told Dan that, in all likelihood, his wife and children had been killed in the impact, and most likely hadn't suffered much, if at all. I guess the man thought that he was giving what consolation he could. Dan was polite enough to that coroner, but I think he still was wrapped in the same daze a cop had found him stumbling around the side of the road in. His face was bright with blood, as was the sweatshirt he'd pulled on for going out. At first the officer wasn't sure who this tall guy was. As he led Dan toward one of the ambulances that had arrived to find themselves useless, he assumed Dan was a bystander who had been caught in the accident, an early morning jogger hit by debris. It took a few minutes for him to sort out that this man had been the driver of the car that was so much fire and metal. When the light bulb went off over his head, the cop tried to question Dan about the chain of events, but he couldn't get much coherent out of him. Eventually, one of the EMTs told the guy that Dan was most likely in shock and in need of the hospital. The fire took the better part of an hour and 3 fire companies to extinguish. Traffic coming into and out of Huguenot was delayed and diverted until early afternoon. 2 weeks after